Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I want to thank our hosts, the wonderful organization of this conference. Many people should be thanked, but I think we have already heard at least some of their names. So what I want to do is to both very briefly tell you how I position my research in sort of on digital matters, and then move on to some of the little projects I'm involved in. So it is in a way not your formal lecture that has a beginning and has a conclusion. This has no conclusion. And I must tell you, I find myself more and more in that situation because I always feel that I'm opening new ground and there simply is no conclusion, you know. The conclusion might not even appear when I write the book. So the first point that I want to make is that this question of the digitization, whatever the term, that it really has variable meanings when it assumes concrete forms, when it is instantiated, so to say. So it can be derivative, you know, doesn't make that much of a difference. It can be transformative, it really changes something, and it can be constitutive. And I'll probably be touching all three, but without specifying. I just want to, because there's a way in which digitization is used as an abstract something, and so I just wanted to nail that down. Now, when you deal with digitization that way, one task is how do you factor in social logics? And so for me, it matters that I focus mostly on interactive domains. And I argue that what happens in the interactive domain cannot simply be reduced to the technical features in play. Access, you know, design, what is the issue? I argue that in interactive domains, and that holds for financial traders, which have their own language, so to speak, and it holds for all kinds of other interactive domains. A larger ecology of meanings gets mobilized. And to a good extent, those meanings are shaped by the non-digital setting. So I hope you're with me. And I'm not going to read these slides. I'm assuming that you can both read and hear me. How is that? Is that too much? I'm assuming too much here? So the example at the bottom that I mention here for scaling is an example. So the powerful, as in financial markets, you know, experience all kinds of network effects. In the end, in the case of finance, it has acquired more power. I argue that the powerless have their own way of acquiring something, but it is often via recurrence. So it remains as a horizontal. The fact that people who work on the struggle for human rights, for instance, they are weak, they are powerless, they are threatened, but by that recurrence, you know, in every country there are some, in every province, whatever, there is a kind of also an effect, you know, a kind of power effect. And I like to think of that as the fact that powerlessness can become complex under those conditions. Now, an element that also hangs in that way of positioning the subject is this notion of mediating cultures. I remember when I first started, I don't know when that was, but it was a long time ago, in the early 1990s, to talk about this in the United States, where the techie culture dominated. You know, one of my efforts was to suggest that the interface, which was the way the techies would see it, the interface is the mediating culture. I said, no, the mediating culture is a thicker, more elusive. And I've done quite a bit of research on that, and I find that extremely interesting. And so I have some very, very marking examples that capture that. And one of these cases that might be of interest in this audience is a study, but it's like a classic study. It goes way back, of high school users. And they took two schools, one a rich public school, this is the United States, one a poor public school. Same concept, one of the big tech manufacturers provided the same computers. This was a comparative study. Same format. The kids, or the kids were between 9 and 10, sitting behind a desk. You know, they had sort of basically terminals, as they used to be called. And here was the comparison. I'm just jumping over kinds of things. The poor kids from poor families, and same level of sort of technical capacity, basically used it to go visit sites, music sites, whatever it may have been. The kids from the rich suburbs used it, though they were sitting next to each other, to network with each other. The interpretation that was given, which became very controversial, and I don't want to discuss that interpretation, was that the rich kids knew that the value added was their friends, their buddies, their neighbors, because they were also from rich families. The poor kids did not imbue their own little friends, their peers, with that kind of value. So, you know, again, I don't want to dwell on that, but that captures this notion of these mediating cultures that shape how it gets used. I have a whole bunch of other ones, but I don't resist mentioning this, which is I think it's a fairly known study, but I'm always amazed how few people know it, you know, but that happens, which is this study that was done by an anthropologist in the Middle East, looking at how young, old, different actors, if you want, different types of people used these technologies. Now we're talking, and these are examples from an earlier period, you know, when there was a kind of purity attached to it because it was not as widespread. It was not our second consciousness, so to say. And so the hypothesis was that the young, who were very good about shopping, etc., were going to be the far more sophisticated users, and that the scholars of the Quran would be truly resistant and not want. They knew that there was some doing. Well, it was just the opposite. The young, sophisticated kids navigated, but they navigated existing sites. The scholars of the Quran had to learn how to create their own space, to annotate, etc. So far more complex use. So again, these are sort of how these cultural mediations. I have done quite a bit of work recently on how the organizational complexity of the user of this technology can produce different outcomes. I compare top-level financial trading firms with very large public libraries. Very large public libraries produce an extraordinary setting, you know, access to millions of volumes. But it's actually a comparatively speaking, simple use of the technology compared to what finance does, which is continuously pushing towards new innovations. It wants this, it wants that. It's just totally different. So again, these are sort of a bit, they have a kind of a counterfactual sense to them. So I wind up sort of arguing that what this focus on interactive domains brings with it is a kind of focus on social digital formations. And again, this is a way of bringing into the fore that it is that what happens in that interactive technical domain has something, or a lot, it varies, of the social in it. Now here it's very interesting, I don't know if many of you are familiar with this, but if you look at how financial traders use their interactive domains, so they have a special language, right? They have sort of little letters, etc. It's pretty standardized. These are global networks. They don't know each other mostly. They don't know who they are. They don't know the names. They can tell when one who becomes a trader and, in other words, has full command over that language is a newcomer. Now, I hope that it is clear why this is meaningful, because very confined, list of items that you're going to deploy and manners of deployment, and yet they can tell. They don't know each other. So that is another way of saying that there is a larger ecology of meanings, etc., etc. Now, I have done quite a bit of work on certain types of cases where I compare powerful users and powerless users, and how digitization can be transformative, constitutive, etc. And so I like to compare financial traders I've been working on finance. My first access to digital technology was because I was looking at finance. It was in the late 1980s. And then resource poor organizations. And one of the things that I found is that they use up to a certain point the same features, decentralized access, simultaneity, etc., etc. But I always say it's a Phillips curve. Huh? They come from different zones, are aiming at different things, and yet there is a lot that corresponds. There is one point in the middle there where they're doing the same things, but then they go again in different directions. So I think that is yet another way of saying that the non-digital, the immediate non-digital, is actually also shaping what happens in digital space. Now, whether that is cultural, social, I don't know. That's my weak point. Culture is my weak point. My husband is great on culture. So great that he takes care of that in the business, in the family business, so to say. But you can for me, there is the cultural in that. Now, I argue that financial trading is a culture. It's not culture, with a capital C, but it is. Now I want to, so what I've just described is stuff that I have published at length and that, it's all over there. But this is new work that I'm doing, and I would love, I thought I had a clock, but I forgot to look at it. Okay, bye. So this is new work, and I would love to get some feedback. And it's with Open Society. I think you know that institution, some of you. The new director is a very radical lawyer, legal scholar, launching very good projects. So there's one project where he asked me to contribute, has to do with low-wage workers. And so that sort of, and this is really a project that has just begun for me. So again, I'm putting it out there. It's a way of thinking about also this question of cultures of use, etc. So it's a project on the future of work and technology, and there you can see what it is about, etc. We were a team of people. So most of the others really had that often happens, I find, had a generic subject in mind, a generic worker, which if you go digging, you realize this is your average sort of, professional level, or at least middle class, etc. And so I, of course, immediately said, okay, what's missing here? Let me go digging, because that's a bit, I am sometimes reactive that way. And I wanted to know something more about the use of, all kinds of innovations, etc., applications among low-wage workers. And out of that came a notion that there is, came a finding first and then a notion. The finding, a severe underutilization among low-wage workers of applications. Secondly, and this is based on data from the Pews, it's not my data, that most low-income workers in the United States do not use their computer to go online, and they are most likely to use Android, not iPhone, etc. So there's a kind of world. And finally, they do spend money on apps, but the only apps that they seem to have either access to or that work for them is really deep in the consumer realm, especially music and entertainment. There were not the kinds of applications, say, that we in the world of the sciences assume, which means that we expect a whole range of applications to exist for what we do. Very often these are collaborative. So one of the questions I had in this project, I still have in this project, is do some of these apps designed for scientists rather than consumption, which is the majority of applications are for consumption. So if you have money, little money, much money, fine, you're there. There is a lot of stuff, including for the poor. The scientist is different. And so since a lot of that is for collaboration, I asked to what extent are some of these applications for scientists actually potentially of use because of this collaborative aspect to poor people. And I'm still checking it out. I have some findings. And the second point was that it seemed to me that this separation between workplace and neighborhood implied in the way the project was designed by Open Society actually left out a critical factor that is a given, unexamined, and sort of basically you don't even talk about it among middle-class workers and up, which is that there is no radical break necessarily between workplace and home. You know, that there is a kind of, and more and more professional workers take some of their work home, etc. I mean, there is a kind of a fluid, you know, space in there. And why cut it off for low-wage workers? Why would that be something, okay, something that works only, no. That the neighborhood had to be brought into the picture and be sort of part of, I called it a social backup system for low-wage workers. And let me give you a little illustration of what I mean. So I then began to do research on what is there for low-wage workers and their low-wage neighborhoods. And in that process, I found quite a list of very new, very modest innovations geared to that. And so one of them that captures what I'm getting at here is called the emergency nanny. So here is the image, just to make it concrete. So here is a low-income parent, mother or father, it doesn't matter, at work. She has a dodgy situation in terms of friend comes and sits every now and then, the neighbor, whatever, that kind of thing. She has a crisis. In a low-wage working place in the United States, you cannot sort of take out your phone, whatever it is, Android or iPhone, and find out who in the neighborhood can help, what parent, what, etc. But what you can do is click on an app very discreetly, and that app, so this is this app called Emergency Nanny, mobilizes the emergency nanny. The emergency nanny is all the people who are stable in the neighborhood, the hairdresser, the little shopkeeper, etc. The grandmother who doesn't have much to do but doesn't want to be a babysitter either, but she can be. So, and so I found this very interesting, and that is sort of what I want to get at. What are applications that actually make the neighborhood function as a social backup system? And I see that as a first step in trajectories that mobilize more and more. The emergency nanny is a first little step in a trajectory of making the neighborhood into a social backup system. And who knows what else? In what I think is my best book, which you didn't mention, I'm just kidding, is the Territory book, Territory Authority Rights. And one of the questions I ask myself there is, do the powerless make a history or histories? And I sort of went digging into all kinds of historiographies. Yes, they do make histories, but they do it with very long temporalities. And of course, there are also often truncated histories where nothing happens. So an example of a long history, generation after generation, where if you look at each generation, you say this is going nowhere, this is finished. The struggles for women's rights, the struggles for black rights, etc., right? So these are multi-generational. Power often makes a transformation far more quickly and with greater clarity. Now, so I want to also emphasize, you read that, right? That neighborhood is an ambiguous term. I just mean a modest locality, you know, basically. Now, there is a second issue that appears in this kind of work, and that is that mostly at workplaces we have semi-automated systems. You know, it's a variable, a whole range. At this end, they begin to be fully automated, but there is usually a person involved at some point still. And so I've been looking at legal cases because the legal cases are beginning to grow. Because there is a real ambiguity as to who's guilty if something goes wrong. And there is this sort of weird absence in, say, the social science literature of trying to understand what is that in-between space. Again, I'm very interested, as you can see, in these in-between spaces. The in-between space here is between whatever worker is involved and that larger technical space that is at least semi-automated, if not like, you know, 3/4 automated. And there are several very, and I should backtrack, and one of the few places where you can actually get into all the details, the boring details that no social scientist might think are worth mentioning, is legal cases. Because in the legal cases, all of those little things matter. The best cases are those where pro bono lawyers who really want to help the poor do a very serious case protecting the low-wage worker who the employer says is guilty of whatever the malfunction that created loss of profits, whatever. The worst cases are those cases where the low-wage worker barely has a lawyer and not much happens, and sort of de facto, okay, you're guilty, and out. And that is happening a lot. Now, we know that the United States is a pretty brutal place when it comes to low-wage workers. I'm sure that there are countries that are much more supportive of low-wage workers. So anyhow, so this then is getting me involved, if you want, with a whole set of questions as to how the legal cases are actually constructed. And this is not the moment to get into it. But again, there is a lot of the culture that gets involved. Because what you have here is a blank. You have the machine, you have the worker, and you have a malfunction. And then you have a blank, because there is not good precedent. There are some brilliant people writing about this, and I'm certainly using their work a lot. And I have a text on that I'm very happy to share that I prepared for Open Society, where I begin to develop all of this stuff in detail. But so for me, the low-wage worker is put at a serious disadvantage when it comes to the question of how these new, semi-automated systems are being deployed. And I think that there is in there also a kind of, if you want, I don't want to push it here, but cultural issue. Culture, very broadly understood. Culture understood the way I understand when I say that financial traders also have a culture. Now, some of the more interesting cases, law cases, are when they involve high-end workers, because they have great lawyers, etc. If you look how finance has defended its position when it comes to these issues, it's quite extraordinary. Now, let me just move. So here I just want to run through this just to give you a sense. I'm not going to describe, but there is a growing list. The list is very, very short. And again, this is focused on the United States. So just to get some sort of closure on it. But this is all kinds of very simple applications that, however, begin to bridge between the low-wage worker and a larger community. That could be other workers, it could be the neighborhood, etc., etc. And I am really interested now in thinking through what are some other applications. Now, you will tell me if culture is in here or not. I happen to think that the cultural is present in all of these processes. It's not culture in the narrow sense. Now, here's another one. I hope you're reading more. So as you can see, this is really a lot of stuff is geared towards low-wage workers. And this is a very ambitious one, developed by a doctoral student, an online intervention that replaces typical therapy involving a health professional with a... So why? Because low-wage workers don't have time to also go. And this is a way of collectivizing where other workers are part of the answers, and all of those workers involved begin to have a sense of they matter, their knowledge matters, etc. So this is sort of, it has the added effect also of mobilizing a network of people. And then there is blah, 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 read quickly. Okay, so you get the sense of what I'm doing here, right? Again, it's this in-between, it's the same thing that I did when I was looking at the work on activists and financial traders. This is sort of in-between unmarked space. I like to use this image that comes from our older imperial times, terra nullius, where we think that nothing happens. And the first step, I repeat, for me, was to say, actually, an interaction in digital space contains within it the non-digital. Out of there, then social social digital formations. Now, with the low-wage workers, It is not only assisting in a particular task, but also creating something where now there is nothing. Little footnote. In the work that I do on political economy, I'm arguing very, very strongly for the notion that we need to relocalize what we can localize, and that this localizing, I'm talking economy now, and that this, so in other words, out with franchises. The franchise is always going to take something out from a community in terms of the consumption capacity that a community has. That's just one example. And that this work of relocalizing also produces sort of a thickness of association, of commitments, you know, rather than the aspiration of collectivity and solidarity. The material practices that one is involved in, same story in this work stuff, are the ones that begin to make tissue where there is nothing. And again, there the image is this, the neighborhood as a social backup system also. Now, so that was sort of that. Now the second point there that you see is the other project that I'm sort of very excited about, is this notion of open sourcing the neighborhood. This is sort of my name for it. You know, I don't know if the name communicates anything. But here is the basic story. And again, I look at low-wage communities because I tend to think that low-income communities, that, you know, the rich, I somehow don't worry about them. Somehow I can't wrap my brain around that. I only worry if they don't support good causes, but that's a different thing. So this notion of open sourcing the neighborhood, here's the scenario. And I've written a few pieces on it. Every member of a neighborhood, and again, neighborhood, modest, confined space, you know, a kind of systematicity in there, has knowledge about that neighborhood, about the setting. And it is a kind of knowledge that the codified knowledge at the center, the expert's knowledge, doesn't capture. The expert knowledge tends to homogenize, to standardize, etc. And so I like to think the grandmother has a lot of time, many grandmothers, not all of them. She gets to know something about the dynamics, you know, over periods of time in the day, etc. The child close to the ground, whatever. The homeless person, in the case of New York, a significant presence. So I want to see those knowledges mobilized, hitting the core knowledge. And given the properties of interactive domains, the speed, the minimalism of acts of communication, remember I'm talking about interactive domains, that they begin to reconstitute. Also, they can dismantle, if you want, disassemble codified knowledges of the center by saying, but my neighborhood, etc. Now, where that all goes, I don't know. But I think with our increasing diversity in our cities, many different types of populations, many different levels of comfort, etc., I think that that notion of bringing in the knowledges of the modest localities and beginning to disassemble the codified knowledge is a very important task. Our cities, our big cities, are going to be increasingly challenges to implement policies, etc., to design policies. So in that sense, open sourcing the neighborhood. Now, I have done quite a bit, of course, on cities, and the stuff that I've been talking about at the level of neighborhoods or individuals or little sort of groups, when you extend it to the space of the city, this notion of larger ecologies of meanings, of course, it becomes an extreme condition. It should mean, however, line at the end, that in the city, you could actually maximize open source urbanism, which you cannot in a neighborhood, because the neighborhood is a sort of a slightly closed system. Again, I hope that is clear. Now, so another sort of issue that to me seems very, very important in all of this is to capture the specificity of social digital formations. It is not simply, you know, a combination of elements that are fairly standardized, and in that sense, using the social, using the cultural, to capture this diversity and specificity. So my effort is less to describe cultural and social particularities as it is to use those particularities to understand something about the digital that I keep thinking is sort of under-narrated, under-appreciated. And so different kinds, if you want, I'm sort of beginning to wrap up now. I would love to get some questions and discussion going. So different kinds of social digital formations that make legible different articulations between the technical and the non-technical. So cultures of use, aims of users, the places where users are located. So it's not so much doing ethnographies, I repeat, of those interactions as using those interactions as windows, in the same way that, say, the Global City was not really an urbanist's book. It was just using the city as a very complex system that at that point begins to instantiate all kinds of non-urban, you know, flows, trends, conditions. So it's sort of, there is a kind of methodological and epistemological element in all of this way. And so here again, wrapping up, you know, the focus on digital interactive domains allows you analytically to distinguish the technical capacities of digital networks from the social digital ecologies within which those technical capacities get activated. And when you take that kind of framing, you discover what we know sort of intuitively, the underutilization of technical properties. So I, for whatever reason, have been invited a few times to keynote these meetings of engineers. And this is one of the issues that I then really focus on, because I'm very interested in hearing what they have to say. And in there, for me, hangs also a question, and I mention it because I'm sort of curious to know if any of you have sort of also dealt with this, which I can have great conversations with engineers about. So it is this bit that the software mobilizes the technical capacities. And so the question that I have for these engineers when I speak with them or to them is, can they detect properties in the material setup, you know, the engineering side, if you want, that are not used? Software designers, or the ones who put together, you know, a whole a range of software, you know, for specific users, they can tell that many of those do not get used, and some get used a lot. There is quite a gap, as we know, between what the engineer designs and in principle, including the software engineer, but also the metal engineer, so to say, and what the software is actually doing, or how it is getting used or underused. So I have this image, like really it's just an image, and it only seems to make sense when I speak with engineers, that there is sort of a range of material features for which we're not developing software, because we don't care. In the same way that when we get all the programs that we buy, etc., there are a bunch of programs that we never use. At least I am that way. You know, there is a lot of dead matter that doesn't have to be dead matter. That sort of, and in that, for me, then also hang in these questions of power. So I know that when I was beginning to do this work in the late 1980s and early 1990s on finance, that finance was such an aggressive user of those capacities that they, you know, at the beginning you don't pick it up, but eventually you see that they are shaping more and more of the software. Now it is now the consumer world dominates, you know, because whatever. But at the beginning you really could capture those asymmetries. And I think we have some of these asymmetries also today. It's just that it's not clear. Now I want to end with this note, which comes back to this disassembling that active participation, including by low-income communities, low-wage workers, by not particularly educated people, by, you know, or say many of the human rights activists and environmental activists that I have sort of interviewed or talked with, they use only certain features, you know, and a lot of the stuff they don't have time, or it's too dangerous to be online very long. So it's just an amazingly particular filières. Huh? So with that kind of notion, in other words, people who use the technology, but who use the software, etc., but who use it in a very singular way, you know, just, and the capacity that emerges, it's sort of a collective outcome that emerges out of that to unsettle, I already mentioned it, to unsettle codified knowledges. So, and I did a whole sort of long, boring paper on this. So I just want to, you know, the first point here, the technology can accommodate multiple particular settings or struggles and still encompass them into a whole through horizontal dynamics. In other words, you take a bit of codified knowledge, a debate, or two different views on how they should develop whatever that empty plot in a city. And people who know very little, people, you know, in other words, I'm talking about one generic image, the powerless. They can move in there, find what they want. The powerless, by the way, that doesn't mean without knowledge. So the obsessive human rights organizer, environmental, etc. You know, they go for certain things. And they capture elements. They often come from very different paradigms. So whoever the person was looking at the paradigms would say, oh my God, but those don't work together. That belong. No, they don't care. And so in that sense, they sort of pick elements, right? They begin to disassemble the code. And I'm now particularly thinking of the planners' code, the ones who run how should the city be developed, etc. And recurrence. The fact that many, let's just to make it concrete, many low-income communities have a kind of a set of recurrent issues that they have to deal with, right? So that recurrence matters here. And so one is you just disassemble existing codified knowledge. You begin to take it out. And then finally, that such possibilities and systemic drives undermine generalizations. Are you still with me? I hope you are. But to me, it's terribly clear. But in other words, think codified bodies of knowledge, think particular actors who use the technology but have only one obsession, and then pull out whatever they can use. And in the end, especially with the velocity, there is not much time to let it all sit for others to come. No, and you wind up with other bodies, other assemblages of these elements, other knowledges. The simplest case is, of course, the neighborhood. You know, the knowledge about the neighborhood. You can pull this and this from the codified knowledge of the Central Planning Bureau or whatever, and you wind up with a set of differences across neighborhoods. Then there are more complex ones, cities, for instance, countries, but also issues. So in that sense, my argument is that the velocity itself of the technology and the fact that you have this extraordinary diversity of users, that actually becomes a driver for informalizing formalized knowledges. And I think that matters. I want to sort of end with an example. So my university, Columbia University, is obsessing about the global university. And when I was recruited from the University of Chicago, so, which is a very serious, you know, the last real German university in the world, as they say, where you talked ideas. So I arrive at Columbia University and everybody's talking global, global, global. And I immediately then wrote a little article in the student newspaper. And I said, what is Columbia University talking about when they say we want to go global? And I suggested going global, and this gives you a sense of what I mean by unsettling codified knowledges. Going global, for instance, would mean setting up a matrix where what you know counts more than who you are. So if the most knowledgeable person, or let's say we could just think of universities, is a professor, obscure professor who hasn't published much, who is in a poor university, but that person, she knows more about subject X than the famous whatever, at the top universities, then that knowledge should be on the matrix. The effect would be that a lot of very famous professors would sort of gradually disappear, and that local, obscure, etc., would actually become, that their knowledges would matter. Now, when you think about it, and the matrix is of course a technology that scientists use a lot. You know, we in the social sciences probably are less likely, but scientists use it a lot. And so it exists as a technology. And it created, of course, that little piece created a lot of controversy. But I think that captures what, at a much simpler level, these low power, the human rights activists, the community organizer, etc., are beginning to do. And they can do it. Disassemble the code and reassemble it, bringing in your particular knowledges. Let me end with a question. And that is a question really to you. When I speak like this, do you see, are there embedded cultures? Cultures of youth, not youth, but youth, cultures of the imagination, etc., etc. To me, it seems that yes. And so, final image is that culture is, of course, something that manifests itself, that gets constituted in many diverse ways. And one of the most interesting features for me about interactive digital domains is that the cultural becomes present in ways that mostly lack the markers of the cultural as we know them. So in there lies a whole other task. Thank you very much.